Okay, guys, good to see you here, all 45 of you. Let's just have a look at who is here and have a look at the poll. Make sure that you guys have voted in the poll. I'm also going to be asking you guys a tricky question. We'll ask the question at the beginning of this and then come back to it again sort of later on. And the question is, what have I done with my notes? That's actually not the question. Just give me a second. I think my notepad is on that side. Here it is. So the question that we're going to be addressing is, does your brain control you, or do you control your brain? And it's a question that's applicable to this particular incident, I mean, to true crime in general. But it's also an important question, I think, to be asking yourself as someone who's on social media, and to be asking yourself quite often, like, is my brain controlling me, or is something else controlling me? What's going on? Who's actually in control here? But the way that we want to address this is to do it through this incident at the Spread Creek camp, right? And then once we've done that, then we're going to apply it back to ourselves. So for now, just keep that thought in the back of your minds. Does your brain control you, or do you control your brain? At the same time that you're thinking about that, think about it with regards to Brian. Do you think Brian's brain was controlling Brian, or do you think Brian was controlling his brain, right? And we're going to deal with the sort of nuances of that in due course. Sharon Tuck, glad to see you here. Terry Dean, Esimka Walensky, Zircon, Robbie Robin, Joan White. Joan White says, really looking forward to this. Wait, what? Good to see you. Victoria, good to see you. Victoria says, I asked my kids to show me their signature. They were both much better than Brian's scribble. Okay, that's also quite interesting. Angela Gallagher says, hi from Texas. Pauline Buckles, regular here, good to see you here. Karen Sanderson, hi from Wisconsin. Morgan LaFay, good to see you here as well. Sabrina Ramsey, Carmel Hughes, Susan L, good to see you as well. Timmy was actually on my lap. I don't know if you saw, he's now, well, he had to get off. Mel Stiller says, I'm really looking forward to this. I'll be back in 25 minutes, okay. Sunflowers says, also looking forward to this. I've got to be honest and say, I wasn't looking forward to this. I don't mean the live, I mean writing this, because it's typically the last, when I write my books, it's typically what I deal with in the last chapter, or the penultimate chapter in the last chapter. And it usually takes quite a lot out of me. It's going intuitively into a very dark place where you try and put yourself in the shoes of the victim and also of the perpetrator. And unless you're a criminal, it's not a lot of fun to do. And it's quite unpleasant. You sort of are intuiting a lot of dark impulses, and it's not fun for me. It takes quite a lot out of me. It's almost like running 10 kilometers. It just drains me. But it is important to do in true crime, so that's why we're here. So in terms of the poll, if you haven't voted, make sure that you do. How much of Brian's narrative is anchored in real events? How much of it is true? I see almost 100 of you have voted. If you haven't voted, make sure you do. 40% said 0% is true, so none of it's true. 1% said that 100% is true. And then around about 60%, 44%, and 14% say it's either a third or maybe 50%. So I'm not going to influence the voting just yet, but make sure you do vote. And then we'll address that a little bit later. We'll come back to the poll. Now, I've got to say, there's an aspect to that question that's quite simple. I think it's quite clear what the answer isn't, but I think what's quite difficult to say with some precision is what the answer is. Is it closer to this or to that? So although it's to some extent a simple and easy question, there's another aspect that's definitely harder. And the whole point of these polls is to get you guys thinking. So we'll see whether your thinking changes and how it changes if it does. Victoria says, I think if there were people who had any hope in Brian's act not being a cold-blooded murder, after his last words came out, those hopes died. True. Although I suppose some might hold on to the fact that, or the point he makes where he says it's something like it was what Gabby wanted, right? Laurie Kovac says, hi everyone, I'm always glad when I catch you live. Good to have you here. Mika Kaplan, it's a great non-fiction story. Holly Davina says probably 15% is true, okay. Pauline Buckle says it is disturbing. Kathy says, Nick, I believe Brian was trying to write a story in the style of the books he pretended to read. Well, that's really an important point. I actually wish I had Lullaby with me, because that is a very important part of his psychology. We know he was reading that book over and over again, and other books by this particular author, and it might be time to revisit those books. I think we were going to do that when another case came by, and I'll actually ask Stephanie. Stephanie actually read Lullaby, and it might actually be time to revisit that if there's interest in it. I'm not sure how much more you guys want to know about this case in terms of Brian's psychology. Okay, are you guys ready to get started? Terry Dean says the ghastly parts are true. Yvette Kelly says, checking in from Las Vegas. Welcome, Yvette. Wanzi says, shalom, everyone. Angela Gallagher says, fiction. Valerie says, there is also some truth in lies. Kathy B, good to see you. Okay, so before we get going with the script that I prepared, also wrote it over a couple of days, I want to share some sort of recent news with you guys. It's sort of come out fairly recently. Gabby Petito's mother slams Brian Laundrie's notebook confession. So she sort of reacted to it kind of in a tweet, and she basically said that she's fed up with the quote-unquote narcissistic confession from her daughter's suspected killer. The tweet actually reads, let me just get to it, just fed up. She wrote fed up, and then hashtag narcissist, hashtag the truth will be revealed, hashtag selfish, hashtag we won't stop, hashtag justice for Gabby, hashtag keep going, hashtag cowards. And then she kind of provided a little image that says, narcissists rewrite history to escape accountability. And I think that's true. I think that is true. There's a certain amount of gaslighting. But something that is maybe worth talking about is Brian Laundrie a narcissist? Let's do a quick poll on that. Do you think Brian Laundrie is a narcissist? Put a 1 if you think so, and a 2 if you think he's not. And we can maybe deal with that at the end of this, once you've kind of gone through this. Do you think Brian Laundrie is a narcissist? Put up a 1 if you think yes. Give it a few seconds to think about. And put a 2 if you think he's not. Gabby's mother obviously thinks that he is. So I'm seeing a couple of 1s, 1 or 2 2s. Maker says puts a 2, Carmel a 2 as well. Pauline Buckles a 2, Zircon a 2, Sunflowers a 2. It's almost an even split, which is quite interesting. Valerie also puts a 2 there. Mama loves Harry Styles, 1. Kathy B a 2. Robbie Robbins says, I don't know without an assessment. Well, we've had quite a lot of time to think about Brian to kind of assess him. What's the basic definition of a narcissist? Does Brian Laundrie fit that? Morgan Le Fay puts it 2. So it's actually quite interesting to see some difference of opinions here. SM Kovalinsky 2. It's quite interesting. Adrian says the term narcissist is so overused nowadays. Lisa J puts it 2. Okay, so we're going to come back to that question. We're also going to come back to the poll. Now let's deal with the 366 words that deal with the actual incident according to Brian Laundrie, right? Do you guys need me to read it through, or are you quite familiar with it? I mean, I'm going to quote from those words, and I'm going to quote sentences. Do you guys need me to review it, or do you want me to get started? How do you guys feel? Susan says he didn't take accountability. Yeah, that's true. That part's true, but a lot of people don't take accountability. Yvonne Phillips says covert. Zircon says no need. Bruce says get started. Okay. Did some of you guys read it in the community post? Did some of you guys review it there? Because you can if you want to. W says no, I hate it. Okay. Okay, so let's get started without reviewing it. Although what I'm going to do is sort of go through it step by step, but in a very systematic way. SM Kovalinsky says, I can see why she would say that, definitely. Terry Dean says, get started. Okay, so let me just change my chair. Okay, there we go. And yeah, let's get going. So the question is, how much of Brian's confession is true? And this is really statement analysis. The previous video I did was, to a large extent, handwriting analysis with a little bit of statement analysis. This is kind of full-on statement analysis, but focused on the 366 words. It's really covering about 2.5 pages from that 8-page thing. So 366 words, that's how many words Brian Laundrie used to describe the incident at Spade Creek Camp. Most reasonable-minded folks following this case don't believe the incident happened as he described it. I'm one of them. I don't believe the incident happened as he described it. And obviously, Gabby's mother doesn't either. I think most of you don't. There is, I think in the poll, I think there's 1% who does believe everything. So a very tiny minority do believe it. But I think we've got to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So if you don't believe it, and I think there are at the moment 43% who say none of it's true, right? 43% of you say 0% of Brian's narrative is true. That's almost half of you. And so what do you do with that? Do you just throw the baby out with the bathwater? Do you just dismiss all of it? And that's why I say we've got to be careful not to do that. We saw that a little bit with the Chris Watts case, where he gave a version of events, and even if it was not, the basics weren't true, there were certain elements that were true. Now you must remember, a lot of liars, convincing liars, when they lie, they use little bits of the truth to make their lie sort of stand up to scrutiny, right? They don't lie about everything, that they try and use little bits of the truth so that the bits that aren't true are quite hard to get at. So the essential question is, what is accurate in those 366 words? And then also, what isn't? Let's just have a look at what Laurie says. I also think that most of the words are his mother telling him what to write, and she didn't fall in the creek. It pushed something down. Okay. There's another theory along the way. Says, I think her agony and seizures were real. Joan White says, yes, weaving lies with the truth. Okay. So the hard part is, so you say what is accurate, then you say what isn't accurate, and then there's the hard part, the third aspect, which is what likely happened that is a slippery combination of some of Brian's words. It's a combination of Brian's words, the coroner's report, and several missing puzzle pieces. So what you really want to do is take Brian's statement, the 366 words, and then gather other evidence that you have, and then kind of put them together and then see what you have, right? See what corresponds, see what is a sort of flagrant contradiction. So one thing that is very much anchored in reality is the coroner's report. What does the coroner say? What does the coroner find in terms of injuries? That's something that can't really be manufactured or altered. An injury is either there or it isn't there. It's either on that part of the body or it isn't there. It's either serious or it's not serious. But then there are several missing puzzle pieces. And one of them is the relationship dynamics. We know that they were arguing, but we don't quite know how those arguments, what the basis was for them. We know some of what it was through the Moab incident, but we don't quite know what the relational dynamics were, and that's some of the missing puzzle pieces. And so the question then becomes, are we able to guess what they are now, right? We've been with this case almost a full year. How good are we in terms of intuition? How good is our knowledge base? And in short, how good is our grasp on reality in this particular case? And that's always a good question to ask, no matter what case you're covering, is how good is your grasp on reality in this particular instance? And then ask yourself, and then does that reflect on your grasp on reality in your own life, in other aspects? And so let's ask that question. How good are we at guessing what happened at Spade Creek Camp, given that we don't actually have the story? And so I think one of the bottom line questions when we ask how much of Brian's confession is true, the subtext to that is, are we able to intuit the relationship dynamics between Gabby and Brian? And specifically, are we able to intuit it now? How good are we a year later at this very difficult, complex thing, right? We've just gone through 6 weeks of relationship dynamics between Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, right? It's very messy and all that. How good are we at intuiting the relationship dynamics of Gabby and Brian, right? So let me just put that question in chat. And I'm going to start off in terms of my assessment with general observations. So we're going to get to what is accurate, what's not accurate, what are the missing pieces, and then a kind of, what's the word? A kind of a recreation, a kind of a dramatization, a kind of a reenactment. Like what happened, if that didn't happen, what did happen? So we're going to kind of gradually find our way there, right? So these are my general observations, and I am going to refer to his text repeatedly. By the way, if you haven't hit the like button, make sure that you do. Okay, so here we go. So these are Brian's words, and he starts off with the following. He says, rushing back to our car, trying to cross the streams of, I think it's Spade Creek before it got too dark to see. Too cold. I hear a splash and a scream. I could barely see. I couldn't find her for a moment, shouted her name. I found her breathing heavily, gasping. She was freezing cold. And then something about the blazing hot national parks in Utah. The words I've highlighted in that one single paragraph are rushing, I hear, see, I couldn't find her, breathing heavily and gasping. But think about the senses that he uses there. I hear, I see, I can't find her. Also this whole idea of rushing, breathing heavily, gasping. Now, when you take a big step back and you say, because Brian volunteers to make this statement, so he's not sitting in a police cubicle where an officer decides how long he's going to be interrogated and what questions are going to be asked. Brian volunteers this. And so he can make it as short as long or as long as he likes. And it ends up being longer than short and shorter than long. It's somewhere on the shorter end of the spectrum, which makes sense because I think Brian would rather not tell us all there is to know. And as we'll find out as we go through this, he doesn't tell us the important things. He doesn't tell us the time, the date, locations, and he's not specific about things like that. He'd rather not tell us those details. And as I say, indeed, he doesn't. What is interesting are the first 7 sentences he uses to introduce the incident, right? The first 7 sentences he uses introduces this incident. So he describes, as I say, rushing, hearing, seeing, then also breathing and gasping. And then Gabby's cold. And then it jumps from cold to the blazing hot desert of Utah. All of that may seem a kind of a bit of a confusing maelstrom, but what it is it's mirroring Brian's thought process. And whether it's confusing to you, there is some structure to something, even if it's confused. It's revealing how the muddle is muddled, right? So we know for Brian that the aftermath of the incident involved him rushing back in the car to Florida, right? So he starts his description saying rushing back, right? Now, let me just go back to the poll question. The question is, how much of Brian's narrative is anchored in real events, right? And it starts off saying rushing back, he says, to our car, but in effect, he was rushing back in our car to Florida. Do you guys get that? We know that he was rushing back in the car to Florida after all of this happened. We know that he rushed back. He did the trip in super quick time, right? He didn't make many stops. He didn't seem to sleep over much. He sort of seemed to drive straight through. So that part's true if taken out of context. I don't think there was any rushing on the night of the incident, besides possibly rushing to bury her. And you might say, we didn't bury her. I just mean leave her in a way that she would not be obviously seen. It's interesting that Brian highlights 2 of the 5 senses here. Not smell, not taste, and not really touch, but hearing and seeing. And these are often the major senses that are activated when a crime has been committed, or even for a victim, if someone is sort of pursuing them. Of course, touch is definitely part of that whole thing as well. And I think the hearing and seeing is likely projection from Brian. What did the other campers hear and see? He's thinking about this from the perspective of what is his story, or how is his story going to correspond? How is his story going to correlate to the people who were there? Are they going to say, yes, we did hear splashing. Yes, we did hear shouting. Or probably they did. Probably there was some of that. He may not know for a fact what was heard and what wasn't, but he may assume certain things. And so I think he seems to sketch this from their perspective, hearing and seeing. And of course, part of the seeing part is saying there wasn't really very much to see. And I think that's part of the point. I also find here is also a truism if taken out of context. No one could find Gabby for almost a month. Brian places himself in the same position. He's searching for her. So in the very beginning of his narrative, where he says, rushing back to our car, I hear a splash. I could barely see. I couldn't find her for a moment. So yeah, Brian puts himself in the same position we were in. Where is Gabby? We're looking for her. He's also looking for her. He's also searching for her. He's trying to find her and effectively save her. And in a way, her own family were trying to do that. Find her, and if she's okay, save her. And I think I couldn't find her is also true in terms of their relationship unraveling, right? They couldn't find each other. So again, you might say, well, strictly speaking, that's not true. But in terms of the echoes of his psychology, there's some aspect to that is true. And bear in mind, the things that we say are echoing something in our thought process, whether it's true or not, but it's some of the vocabulary that is going on internally, right? And I think the same is going on here. So one's got to ask, what did witnesses hear, or what could they have heard? Could they have heard Gabby screaming? Could they have heard Brian shouting her name? And I think this is likely 100% accurate. I think Gabby did scream. I think Brian did shout her name. So that part, that little part, is probably 100% accurate. Now we go a little bit further. The temperature had dropped to freezing and she was soaking wet. I carried her as far as I could from the stream toward the car, stumbling, exhausted and shocked when my, I think it's knees, buckled, and I knew I couldn't safely carry her. I started a fire and spooned her as close to the heat. She was so thin and already been freezing too long. I must say, just that aspect's like, hasn't this just happened? So why is there like this length of time that she's got hypothermia already? Anyway, I mean, I'm just saying that's not very believable. Then he says, I couldn't at the time realize that I should have started a fire first, but I wanted her out of the cold back to the car. From where I started the fire, I had no idea how far the car might be, only knew it was across the creek. So in terms of these two paragraphs, I've highlighted, I carried her as far as I could from the stream toward the car. And then also the part where he says, I should have started a fire first, but I wanted her out of the cold back to the car. From where I started the fire, I had no idea how far the car might be, only knew it was across the creek. What we get out of that is that he did start a fire, and probably in the schema of the incident, he probably did, there was a fire was probably going. A fire is probably part of the story in terms of what ultimately happened. So Brian describes carrying Gabby towards the car, and this is the part that he doesn't really flesh out. He said he doesn't describe himself carrying her back. That's something we kind of infer. He describes carrying Gabby towards the car, but doesn't describe himself carrying her back. And when he realized, so in other words, when he realizes he's not strong enough, he obviously, in his story, turns around and heads back, right? Probably the thought did occur to him, I'm talking about in the schema of this, probably the thought did occur to him to carry her to the car, but in order to remove her from the location. I mean, in the sort of wishful thinking paradigm of a criminal, you don't really want to leave someone lying around. You know, if you've committed a crime, you'd rather not kind of leave a body lying somewhere if you can possibly not do that. So what are your options? Well, the option is put the body in a car, drive somewhere else, and then dispose of it that way, right? So probably the thought did occur to him to carry her to the car and remove her from the location. And maybe in his own mind, he thought of that, and then he decided, no, I'm not going to do that. And so maybe his narrative reflects that part. I think it may be true then that he didn't carry her because she was too heavy. So why would he not do that? Well, he may have figured, well, she's too heavy, number one. Number two, because it's too far. And number three, that he might be seen doing so. And I'm not quite sure which one he would give the highest priority. It might be that she was too heavy. It might be because it was too far as well, which goes together with that. But what is quite interesting, and we can thank Brian Enton for this, and there are quite a few additional insights we get from just seeing Brian Enton in the sort of little video that he took. Those of you following this on Patreon, where I provided the script and I provided the images, you see Brian Enton, it's just a screen grab though, of him walking across the creek, but stepping into the water. And you kind of look and you thought I had was, is he wearing waterproof shoes? Because if he's not, those shoes are going to get pretty cold. His feet are going to get pretty cold pretty quickly. Choice says, did she end up in the van? No, she didn't. I don't actually, we haven't seen any kind of police report, but I don't think you're going to find anything really in terms of that. Anyway, Brian Enton tweeted at the time, this is the creek, full cell service, and the van was to the right of me up a small hill, maybe a 1-minute walk from this spot. And then he says, I think the way Brian Enton describes it was that the distance from the van to where Gabby was left behind was about 10 minutes walking. So the walking time from one side of the creek to the other side was about 10 minutes. He actually says less than a 10-minute walk. So that's still quite a lot of time. I don't know if it's 7 minutes or 8 minutes, but it's quite tricky walking across there, and there are quite a few stream bits. But where Brian says less than a 10-minute walk, 10 minutes is quite a long way to walk, especially carrying things, right? And anyway, my point is that Brian, probably talking about Brian Laundrie, probably thought that is too far to be doing things really out in the open. And I mean, he's surrounded by flat terrain, he's surrounded by rocks. The line of sight, when he's crossing there, is really it goes on for very, very far. The line of sight is too dangerous in terms of what he wants to do. So that brings us to the next aspect from his statement. He says, when I pulled Gabby out of the water, she couldn't tell me what hurt. Now, it's possible the crime was executed inside the tent. I think that's another question you've got to ask yourself. Where do you think the crime took place? Do you think it took place in the van? Do you think it took place in some arbitrary natural setting, like perhaps they went for a walk on a path, and so it sort of happened just sort of outside somewhere? Or do you think it happened in a camp situation, like either in the tent or near the tent, or sort of while they were sitting by a campfire or something? Which one do you think is likely? Let me ask it again. Do you think the crime happened inside the van? It's very important to ask these questions. Where did the crime take place? When did it take place? How did it take place? What was used? And all those things. But in terms of this, what's the location of the crime? Was it inside the van? Was it inside the tent? Or was it somewhere else entirely? My sort of supposition is that I think it's possible that the crime was executed inside the tent, and that once deceased, Brian had to pull Gabby out, meaning out of the tent. So he says, when I pulled Gabby out of the water, he says, when I pulled Gabby out of the water, she couldn't tell me what was hurt. I think Brian possibly pulled Gabby out of the tent. This is when she wasn't moving, when everything was over. And obviously she couldn't tell him what hurt because she couldn't tell him anything at that point. Adrian says, I think it was outside. Then he goes on to write, she had a small bump on her forehead that eventually got larger. It's quite a strange way of putting it. It's almost like he's minimizing the bump, like I didn't realize it was so bad or something. Now, it's not a pleasant thought, but here I think Brian is slyly understating the graphics of what he did to Gabby. Presumably, and this is just my opinion, and I say this with sadness and compassion and sympathy to Gabby, because this is definitely not a pleasant area that we're going into. But obviously the whole area is fraught with, well, what really happened? So we kind of got to go into the area. So let me just read it through again. Gabby had a small bump on her forehead that eventually got larger. I don't think it's, I think it's a sly understating from Brian here that the graphics of what he did to Gabby was done presumably with a large rock. Remember, the cause of death here is manual strangulation, which Brian may have done after hitting her, possibly with a fist, then with a rock. In other words, it escalates like that, right? The next part of his statement reads, her feet hurt, her wrist hurt, but she was freezing, shaking violently. While carrying her, she continually made sounds of pain. Laying next to her, she said little, lapsing between violent shakes, gasping in pain, begging for an end to her pain. Now, Gabby perhaps did beg Brian right? Think about that. Gabby perhaps did beg Brian. Think about the Moab incident. You also got the feeling that she was um, um, not just admonishing him, but also trying to reason with him and kind of pleading with him. Now, please don't do this. Please unlock the door. Please don't leave me here. Please stop, or whatever it was. And I think in this situation, the same thing. Gabby perhaps did beg Brian not to hurt her, but to stop hurting her. So his story is that she asked him to hurt her, and I think Gabby begged him to stop hurting her. Right? I think that's kind of obvious, but it nevertheless needs to be said. Then he goes on to say, she would fall asleep and I would shake her awake, fearing she couldn't close her eyes if she had a concussion, or fearing she shouldn't close her eyes if she had a concussion. I think probably the reverse was the case. At some point, Brian wanted confirmation that she was deceased, right? This happens with all homicides. If you think about Chris Watts, if you think about Letitia Stork, although that case is still in the process, but all sorts of current cases. But let's take the Chris Watts case. After somebody does what they're meant to do, they want confirmation that the person is no longer alive. It's like, can I let go now? Have I done enough? Is it over, right? And it doesn't really mean necessarily someone stopped moving, that they are deceased, right? There can still be a minimal amount of breathing and so on. So where he says, she would fall asleep and I would shake her awake, fearing she shouldn't close her eyes if she had a concussion. What he's revealing in that is his paying attention to her eyes and whether her eyes are open or closed, and whether there's concussion behind those eyes, right? And I think he didn't want to make sure she was alive, but that she wasn't. He wanted to make sure that she wasn't alive. And one indicator would be, as I say, in her eyes. Are her eyes responsive? One of the key things that medics do when they come upon someone who's injured, but someone who's sort of not moving, is they will shine a torch into the eyes and they'll see if the eyes respond, right? Eyes also come up in the Chris Watts case, and even if a killer has intent, this is likely a disconcerting moment after the fact. So even if they want to do what they're doing, even if they plan to do what they were doing, when this actually happens, when the killer looks into his victim's eyes and sees no response, there's probably quite a disconcerting moment. It's like, they're not seeing me. It's done. It's over. And now they know they've achieved their goal, and they also know they're actually in real trouble now, unless they can hide the evidence, and that becomes the next step in their criminal journey. And so they suddenly find themselves also inside the newly arrived conundrum that the person they were talking to a moment ago, the person that was very active a moment ago, is now simply remains. What used to be a person, ambulant, making sounds, having some kind of influence, is now simply remains. And that means they're hard to move, they're heavy and leaking fluids. And this is all a problem in terms of evidence from the perpetrator's perspective. Now we go to the next paragraph. She would wake in pain, start her whole painful cycle again, furious that I was the one waking her. She wouldn't let me try to cross the creek, thought like me that the fire would go out in her sleep. And she'd freeze. I don't know the extent of Gabby's injuries, only that she was in extreme pain. I think him saying, I don't know the extent of Gabby's injuries, is a little bit like saying, almost like, I didn't know she was injured. It's got nothing to do with me. I did nothing, right? And also that kind of that she'd injured herself, right? The other thing that I think is quite interesting is where he says, thought like me that the fire would go out. In other words, they were both thinking that the fire was going to go out. What fire do you think that he's really referring to there? Thought like me that the fire would go out, right? So in terms of the poll, how much of Brian's narrative is anchored in real events? I see 0% is, I think, down a bit to, no, it's not down, it's still at 42%. And let's just have a look at some of the comments here. Heather Turner says, I would like to see how this compares to his narrative when the cops pulled him over a few days before her death. How he, yeah, well, I mean, that's exactly what we're doing. That is exactly what we're doing. So from that particular paragraph, I've highlighted in bold the words furious. And also, she wouldn't let me try to cross the creek. And also, the fire would go out in her sleep, right? Someone likely was furious in those dying moments. Do you agree with that? Heather Turner, thanks for joining us. Someone likely was furious in those dying moments. Do you guys agree with that? Possibly there were some arguments about sleep as well. I mean, he's talking about she was furious that he was the one waking her. Possibly doing this, at this point, they were almost 2 months into their van life journey. And we know that they both struggled a bit with anxiety. And in some cases, they were sleeping where it was extremely hot, or it was raining, or it was, in this case, cold. So possibly there were arguments about sleep. And there often are in a tent. There often are arguments about sleeping arrangements in tents, in tent-based camping, in camping scenarios. I think you can have arguments between friends, you can have arguments between couples, you can have arguments between strangers. If you'll indulge me for a moment, a couple of years ago, I hiked the Fish River Canyon. It's the world's second biggest canyon after the Grand Canyon. It's in Namibia, which neighbors my country. And so I was hiking, and it was actually slack packing, where mules were carrying our bags. But every night we would sleep in a tent. And I'm a little bit allergic to dust, maybe very allergic to dust. And I understand that I was snoring quite a lot and quite badly. And there was nothing I could do about it because the air was so dry and so dusty. But the problem was there wasn't, like, how far can you pitch your tent compared to someone else? And so after a while, I realized that I was a bit of persona non grata. I'd kept someone awake because I'd been snoring. And so they eventually were very not happy with me. And that's just the reality of sleeping in tents. Another thing that I remember when I was sleeping on the top of a mountain, South Africa's highest mountain, I was sleeping on Monte Sources. I remember, I think I was sleeping in my sister's sleeping bag, and I happened to fold the bottom of the bag under my feet, but I didn't know that I'd done that. And then I just assumed that her sleeping bag was a size smaller than mine, kind of thing. And so the sleeping bag only came up to about here. And so I was freezing cold because it was really, really cold, and I needed to get into the sleeping bag. And so I was not tossing and turning, although I suppose I was a little bit, but I was awake and uncomfortable and distressed while everyone else was sleeping. So I wasn't really very happy. Now, sometimes someone in that situation is going to disturb other people, right? I'm just saying it often happens that you're uncomfortable, you're awake, you can't sleep for whatever reason when you camping. Another issue can be sounds like and insects. You can have the wind blowing against your tent. I know that was a problem when I camped in Australia. There's one day where the wind just kept flapping the tent the whole night. Sometimes it's just odd sounds, a car door closing here, mosquitoes buzzing there, a kid shouting here, whatever it is, and you just can't fall asleep, kind of thing. So having trouble falling asleep in a tent can be the source of dissension, right? It can be the source of unhappiness, and that's something that he says. He says that Gabby would wake up furious that I was the one waking her, right? And so the question is, is there some truth in that? And I'm saying possibly there were some arguments about sleep after 2 months on the road. I mean, Brian might be dirty, Brian might be snoring, Brian might want to read, Brian might be suffering from anxiety, Gabby might want to compose an Instagram post, Gabby might be responding to comments on Instagram, Gabby might be wanting to work on their website. Gabby might be wanting to talk on the phone to Rose or her family or other friends, all these things. And now it's at really, really close quarters, right? And obviously, when someone turns on their phone at night, you lying next to them, you know that immediately. And so it's that kind of thing as well. So I think probably there were some arguments about where they wanted to go as well. So besides sleeping, where they wanted to go. Well, we're going to go this way, or we're going to go that way. In terms of the Spread Creek camp, are we going to pitch our tent here or there, right? And there were just the same arguments in Moab, where do we stay at the co-op and work, or do we go and hike and get some water somewhere else or whatever it is, right? That's exactly what happened at Moab. Was Gabby wanted to stay and work, and Brian got fed up. Brian was tired of sitting around and, nothing happening, right? And I don't think he wanted to drink. I don't know if there's bottled water where they were, but he didn't want to drink that water. And I think Gabby got thirsty. So another aspect that I think is quite interesting is the fire would go out in her sleep is perhaps a subconscious reference to Brian fearing that the fire in Gabby's heart, the fire for him, her fire for him, the fire of love, the fire of passion, was going out, and he wasn't going to allow that. He didn't want to allow that fire to go out. And so the fire going out like love running out, he equates that with freezing, and freezing with death, right? Again, you've got to refer back to what he says. He says, she wouldn't let me try to cross the creek. So he wants to go somewhere and she won't let him. And I think that happened a lot on their trip. Also, thought like me that the fire would go out in her sleep and she'd freeze. I'm just saying the fire going out in her sleep is perhaps a subconscious cue, a reference to Ryan fearing that the fire in Gabby's heart for him was going to go out, and he wasn't going to allow that. The fire going out, like love running out, equates with freezing, and freezing with death. I don't think the cold was as much of a factor as he makes it out to be. So I think if you really want to be scientific about this, and that's what True Crime Rocket Science is all about, and that's what you have to do when you're investigating, is you have to be scientific. You've got to check the data. So that's what I did. So you ask a simple question, was it cold? When he talks about freezing, it was cold, cold, cold. How cold was it? Well, go and check, go and find out, right? So I did that, and I think it's one thing to say, I don't think the cold is really a factor, as big a factor as he made out in August in Wyoming. Well, go and check. What is August like in Wyoming, right? In the Grand Tetons, like what is going on? Although early mornings just before sunset would be quite cold, around about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 4 degrees Celsius. That is quite nippy. So, but that's early mornings. So just before sunset, it would be pretty cold. It still wouldn't really be freezing. I mean, maybe freezing is his word, but nothing would really freeze at that temperature. And also, I believe the incident likely occurred late at night. I don't think the incident occurred early in the morning, and we don't really know. We don't know whether it happened in the middle of the day, in the morning, or at night. That's where you've got to draw inferences. I believe it occurred late at night, but it could also have happened very early in the morning. It could have happened when it was cold. I don't think it did, though. And if you go to August 27th, between 8 and 10 p.m., the temperature would have been cool, but not really cold. It would have been around about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 15 degrees Celsius. That's cool. That's not really going to be a problem for campers, right? And I get this information from the following site. Let me share it with you. So I've gone to a website called weatherspark.com, and it provides really detailed weather for the Grand Tetons with everything from temperature, clouds, precipitation, the moon cycles, humidity, wind direction, all that kind of thing. And you're going to see just how pertinent all of that data is as we go through this. In other words, we're going back to that day and we're asking ourselves, what was that day actually like? What were the camping conditions? Remember, when you're outside in a tent, you feel the conditions much more keenly than if you inside four walls, right? Wait What says, yes, but river water is very cold. It comes from the mountains. That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. We'll get to that though. And there's something very relevant to what you just said there. What about the water in the river? So yeah, just to reiterate, the early morning temperature, the coldest time of the day would be about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And at around about bedtime or in the evening, between 8 and 10, it would be 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is not too bad. So then we get to this quite hard to read paragraph from Brian, where he says, I ended her life. I thought it was merciful. That is what she wanted. But I see now all the mistakes I made. I panicked. I was in shock. But from the moment I decided, took away her pain, I knew I couldn't go on without her. And this is where, so what I've highlighted here is that is what she wanted. And also from the moment I decided, those two expressions. And that raises this question, was he panicked before he did what he did, right? Was he panicked before he did what he did? And that brings us kind of back to this question that I asked, which is, does your brain control you or do you control your brain? So you first ask that question, then you ask that question in terms of Brian Laundrie. Did Brian's brain control Brian or did Brian control his brain, right? We're going to come back to that question, but think about that in the context of, was he panicked before he did what he did? Was he in shock before he did what he did? If he thought their relationship was falling apart, and think about the Moab incident, were there shocking moments then? Was there panic moments then, right? What do you think the answer is? When Brian went back to Florida, what was there concerns and things going on then? Robbie Robbins says brain controlled Brian. It's quite funny that Brian's name, if you scramble the letters, brain and Brian, almost you can spell them with the same letters. Anyway, if he thought their relationship was falling apart, and bear in mind, we know that from Nicole Schmidt that there was this escalation in tension. She said it. We know that the Moab incident demonstrated that, and we know that it was 2 weeks after the Moab incident, Gabby was dead. That shows how the things did escalate, right? So their relationship was falling apart. And I think more particularly if she told him, if there was a point where she said, this isn't working out, or I'm not sure this is working out, or I'm confused, that would be a shock to him. You know, from being engaged to this would be quite a shock. That would give someone engaged a sense of panic. Do you agree with that? Anyone who's engaged, where someone says to them, I'm having second thoughts about us, is going to feel shocked and panicked, especially if they really want to go ahead with it. they can also be thinking, what are other people going to be thinking about this, right? And then I also think there's some indication here that this is a premeditated murder, right? And we get that from where he says, from the moment I decided, right? Those are quite unusual words to use here. He says, from the moment I decided. Isn't that a possible indication that this is a premeditated murder? And I wouldn't be surprised if it is, even if you take those words away. And what I mean is, hadn't Brian thought about this before, right? Hadn't Brian entertained this idea before? We know they had many, many arguments and that was escalating. Hadn't the thought occurred to him before? And where do you think that thought came from? Well, just give me a second. I want to show you where I think that thought came from. I'll be away for 10 seconds. Just be patient. So don't you think that this is where that psychology came from? So this idea of the moment I decided and having sort of fantasies, do you think that it could have come from this book or other books that he was reading? So if I read the blurb to this book or this description here, it says, ever heard of a culling song? It's a lullaby sung in Africa to give a painless death to the old or infirm, right? So the whole point of this particular thing, and it's from this book, Lullaby, is that you actually put someone out of their misery. Well, isn't that what he's doing or says he's doing in the suicide note, right? It's a lullaby sung in Africa to give a painless death to the old or infirm, someone who's injured. The lyrics of a culling song kill, whether spoken or even just thought. And then it says here, when reporter Carl Streeter discovers that unsuspecting readers are reading the poem and accidentally killing their children, he begins a desperate cross-country search to put the culling song to rest and save the nation from certain disaster. And then certain other things take place where certain people learn this song and start using it on various people. And it's maybe something that we can talk about with Stephanie, who has read this book, and we can talk about how this psychology, is it present in the 366 words or not? I think that's quite a different approach and quite an interesting approach as well. Look at some of your comments here. Ferret says, another channel checked the temperature and found it was in the low 30s. Susan says about 36 degrees. On the 27th. Stargirl says, I do think that he could have hit Gabby on the head, thrown a rock, perhaps, and injured her badly. And then, okay, Kathy says, he attempted to write something, but I don't believe he actually read the book. Why not? Why wouldn't he have read the book? His actions towards her seemed that he didn't respect her at all. He heard voices and acted on them kind of like out of his mind. Terry says, Nick, where do you think is the last proof of life in his confession, in this confession? It's quite a difficult question. I'll have to think about that. Okay, so to return to what I said here, where I said, was he in shock before he did what he did, and was he panicked before he did what he did? You must bear in mind that Brian isn't like many people. He's got really low self-esteem. He's got ego problems. He doesn't have a big framework of people around him. He doesn't have a lot of friends. So if things don't work out with Gabby, it's like a catastrophe. It's devastating, right? So what I'm trying to get at is, when your whole universe is one person and that person says, I don't think it's working out. I think I'm confused about us. I didn't realize who you really are. You don't know how to love or whatever. That is going to make someone like Brian panic, because it's like, my one friend in the world. You must remember, Gabby's his everything. It's his family. It's his lover. It's also like his best friend. He's going to lose all of that. And the idea of losing all of that is like he's going to lose everything. And if he loses everything, he's going to have nothing. He's going to be nothing. He is nothing without her. That is going to make him panic. That is going to make him shocked, right? So that part, I think, is also true from that particular interpretation. Where he says, from the moment I decided, you must really think about those words with regard to the lullaby aspect of this book, which is really chilling and really something maybe to go into. So that's as far as the general assessment goes. Now we're going to go far more into a filtered analysis, and we're going to go far more sort of precise, interrogation of Brian's statement. So in order to get clarity on what's credible and likely true and what isn't, we're going to run the narrative through 4 additional filters. Number 1, what is accurate? So just under that, what's accurate, we're going to identify that. Then number 2, what's not accurate? Then number 3, what is left out? What isn't there that should be there? What's the absence of evidence here? And number 4, what likely did happen based on his narrative, as well as going beyond it. That's where we've got to do the hard job of conjuring up these missing pieces and trying to connect the dots, right? That's the really difficult part. So yeah, we start with what is accurate. How about it got too dark to see? Now, once again, this is under the assumption that this crime took place at night. If you think it took place in the day or in the morning or something, then I don't think that is true. But I have always believed that it did take place in a camping scenario where they were close to one another, and there was going to be some sort of either expectation of intimacy, or they would have at least a chance to talk to one another. And within that, and it's also the aftermath to the Merry Piglet, something happens. There's a conflagration. So where he says it got too dark to see, I think that's true. But I think he's meaning that in terms of for other people couldn't see what they were doing. So if they were arguing, people wouldn't be able to see what they're arguing, so they could continue arguing from Brian's perspective. But let's also check this with the data, the scientific data. Was it too dark to see? How would it not be dark? Well, what if the moon was up? And what if it was a full moon? Now, I've camped outdoors in the Kalahari, and when it's a full moon, it is everything is pretty visible. It's actually quite scary. Certainly the air in the outdoors is very clear, and when the moon is full, that's when you should go camping, is when the moon's full, and then everything is very clear. You don't even need to use a torch or a flashlight. So in terms of, is this accurate? So he says it's too dark to see. Is it accurate? Well, let's go to the scientific data. Bear in mind the moon cycle on August 27th was waning gibbous at 76%. So it was a 76% full moon, which is quite a lot. So that's the first thing to mention. So it's not like there wasn't a full moon, there was. So does that mean that it wasn't dark if there was a waning gibbous at 76%? Well, moonset, and this is my understanding of it, maybe I've misinterpreted it, but moonset was at 8:06 p.m. on the 27th of August, right? And so after moonset, it would have gotten dark. And I believe that this crime took place somewhere between 8 and 10, sort of, like at dinner time and when you're going to settle down to sleep kind of thing. at that time when you are starting to move closer to one another as campers, right? When it starts getting darker, when it starts getting colder, when it starts getting later. So only after 8:06 p.m., after moonset, would it be pitch dark, or it would be pretty dark. And I think it's likely Brian did much of the burying and covering up under the cover of night. It probably would have been a tough call to make a fire after Gabby had died. So if Gabby had died, I think if there was a fire going, he probably would have put it out. And then he would have gotten cold. But if you think about it, if you were a murderer and you were outdoors and you just done something, would you want a fire going where someone might see, well, there's a fire there, I think I'm going to go and ask them if they've got marshmallows or if they've got coffee? Or you're going to try and say, well, do not disturb, we are sleeping, nothing to see here, campers are no longer available. You know, like it's almost like putting a do not disturb on your hotel. So that would be quite a tough call. It's cold, but do you want someone to come around, you know, because there are people there, even if it's unlikely, or maybe you want to put the fire out because you don't want to draw attention to the campsite, let alone illuminate it. It's also possible after executing the crime that Brian slept in the van. So it's also possible, whatever he did, later on he decided, well, it's cold and I am going to go to the van. And maybe he went there, who knows, 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, whenever. So that's also a possibility. I mean, the question is, where did Brian sleep? Now, if you think about, if he did do something to Gabby, would he just sleep beside her? Nobody knows. It's quite an awful question to contemplate, but it certainly is a question. So I think it did get cold. I think there was splashing and screaming. I think that part is accurate. Whether or not you say it's related to the crime or the incident, they were in a creek scenario. So whatever they were doing, they were splashing. They were walking through the creek and back through the creek. So there was splashing going on. I think screaming is likely under the circumstances. Given Gabby's injuries, I think screaming is very likely. Gabby possibly did try to run away or try to run back to the van. And we know that she did that at the co-op in Moab, that she was trying to get into the van. And maybe Brian didn't want to allow that either. Maybe it was like, don't try and get away from me to the van. I want to talk about this. I want to sort this out. Stop trying to run away from me, or whatever it was. And he didn't want that to happen. It could also have been that she took the keys and then he didn't know, was she going to drive off or what kind of thing. Then he says her wrist hurt. That could have been from, he's trying to wrestle her phone out of her hand or the keys out of her hands, and that's why her wrist hurts. Or she's perhaps trying to punch him and then he grabs her hand or whatever. But I think her wrist hurting is likely from defensive wounds and Brian grabbing them. It's interesting that just one wrist is mentioned. Then he writes, I couldn't find her for a moment. Now we're going through all the things that I think are accurate here. So far, it did get cold. It did happen in the dark. There was splashing and screaming. Her wrist hurt. I couldn't find her for a moment. And so perhaps Gabby did escape. Perhaps there was a moment where there was a little bit of, let's say, small violence between them. Perhaps she'd slapped him. Perhaps they'd had a little bit of an argument, the argument before the fatal argument. Perhaps Brian said, no more social media tonight, or I'm not letting Rose join us, and stop talking to her on the phone and give me your phone or whatever. Maybe Gabby did escape. Maybe she had her phone with her. Maybe that caused Brian to panic. Maybe that caused Brian to pursue her in fear that she might abandon him or call somebody or do something. And so she runs away. Brian pursues her, captures her, and then subdues her. And then there's a reference here. I found this fascinating to the blazing hot national parks in Utah. It all brought the salty confrontation at the Moab co-op back. I think what was happening at Sped Creek Camp brought back the confrontation at Moab. I think it was an echo of that, and then it got worse. But bear in mind, it's all of that stuff, and things have now gotten worse. It's all of that stuff, and there's more insecurity about the relationship, more fear and anxiety and opprobrium, right? Then he says she was soaking wet. I think she was, but not with water. Stumbling, you would stumble on those rounded rocks, which would make escape more difficult. When you see that little video clip that Brian Enton put on Twitter of himself crossing the Spade Creek, the creek at Spade Creek Camp, you see him sort of stepping unsteadily. I'm not saying he stumbles, but he steps quite unsteadily. And this is in the day. You can imagine stepping even more unsteadily if it's not very easy to see. Even if the moon is shining, it would be quite difficult to step on some of those rounded rocks that are submerged, right? The other thing is, if you were trying to run away, trying to step on those rocks while you're running would cause you to trip and possibly fall into the water. And then if that did happen, you can imagine Gabby saying, well, I'm not sleeping in the tent, I'm sopping wet, I want to sleep in the van. And maybe Brian didn't want that to happen. And maybe then there was bickering about the fire. Get a fire going, I'm cold, well, then I'm going back to the van, etc., etc. I think the truest word from Brian's brief statement, and the only one that alludes to emotions, is furious. So I think there's a lot of truth in that particular word. And the question is, who's furious? Is Gabby furious, or is he furious? Or are they both furious? Was Gabby furious with him, or was he furious with her for wanting to share, for example, or spoil their honeymoon by inviting Rose along? His words are, furious that I was the one waking her. And so again, the question comes up, did they struggle to sleep? Then, or did he keep waking her in the tent or in the van? Then he says, I ended her life. He did, that's true. He says, I thought it was merciful. Perhaps he really believed that it was a mercy, but not for her, for himself. In that respect, it might be arguably true. So he may have thought that it was a mercy for himself, only to realize the agony once she was gone. So at the time, he may have thought, I'm putting myself out of my misery. And then later on, wow, I miss Gabby. I wish I could talk to her. I'm sorry, I miss her, whatever. Then I think his psychology appeared to be that she was going to leave him, so he killed her. That's how I understand it. His psychology seems to be, I think she's going to leave me, and so that's why I'm going to do this. And so it was a kind of control. It prevented her from leaving him, yes. So what he did prevented her from leaving him, but it also prevented everything else. After killing her, he still experienced it as her leaving him. But in her absence, he controls the narrative. He frames it as an act of mercy and something she wanted, and imagines joining her in the afterlife. So he kills himself while framing himself as the hero. So that's the part that's accurate, in my opinion. Richard says, in my opinion, the notebook was BS from start to finish. Well, Richard, now we're dealing with the BS part. What's not accurate? Obviously, Brian is no hero, and that's probably what Gabby saw and what he knew and what he sort of, it's like if someone sees something about you that's not true, it's probably not going to bother you. But if they see something about you that is kind of true, then it is going to bother you. And I think because Brian is no hero, because that's probably what Gabby saw, I think that's why he committed the crime in the first place. He wanted to be the hero. He tried to be, but what is the opposite of a hero? Guys, what is the opposite of a hero? Sharon Tuck says, Nick, thanks for your insights as always. Thanks a lot, Sharon. Pedal for Show says, I don't think Brian hit her with a rock at all. I think he just beat her up severely. Do you think you can cause blunt force trauma with your hands? Boston Girl says coward. Yeah, so the opposite of a hero is a coward or a loser, right? The opposite of a hero is a coward or a loser. And I think Brian was both. Brian was someone with no job, no money, no prospects, no game. I think a bit of a flaky confidence. I think Brian was all of those things. But with Gabby in his life, as we saw during the Moab incident, Brian could be the hero taking care of the emotional damsel in distress. But in reality, he was the damsel in distress. What do you guys think about that? Double Rainbow says, do you think Roberta supervised this manipulative confession? No. The money he did have was possibly tied up in funds or trusts. Some of you might say, but he did have money. I don't think he had access to the money, which is why they were running out of money. And I think the money that he did have was like his parents' money that was sort of tied up in funds or trusts in his name. So it's his money, but he doesn't really have access to it, or it's not directly accessible. And that's also why he appropriated Gabby's bank card. Then another thing that I think is not accurate is rushing back to our car. I don't think that's accurate unless, for whatever reason, one of the pair decided they didn't want to camp on the opposite side of the creek. So Gabby might have wanted to go to the car if she had fallen into the creek, right? Then she may have wanted to get back to the van and even rush back to the van. Perhaps they couldn't find a decent place to set up their tent with all the boulders and the uneven terrain, and it just wasn't a great spot. And Gabby was saying, this isn't going to work, meaning the camping arrangements. And Brian was like, no, we'll make it work. Let's do this. Another possibility is perhaps they couldn't find dry firewood. We know that there were 2 to 3 days of rain on the 21st, 22nd, and 23rd of August. So the conditions underfoot may have been on the damp or muddy side, and that also makes camping not fun. You're dirty, you're slipping and sliding, and things aren't really dry, and it's not very fun. So just 4 days preceding the incident, they had 3 days of rain, right? And that's also on the site weatherspark.com. It provides the amounts and the times and so on. And so this rain may have translated to snow in the mountains, and someone spoke earlier about what about how cold the water was, the water in the creek. That's definitely a factor. And also, did they have waterproof footwear? And I think they did. And what's quite interesting is Gabby's footwear was left, her hiking boots. She wasn't wearing them. They were actually lying not far from her remains. So the question is, what quality of footwear were they? Did Gabby get them wet? When Brian Enton crossed the creek, did his footwear get wet? It's maybe a question to ask him. Did his feet get wet? Did he take his shoes off shortly after that? And I think if your trousers, the top of your trousers get wet, then I think a lot of that, even if you do have very good waterproof boots, the wetness and the dampness can get into your feet and into your shoes that way as well from the top. So if it did rain, it may have translated to snow in the mountains, but may also have elevated the level of the river. So the river may have been flowing quite strongly on August the 27th. It could have been flowing more strongly than what you see in Brian Enton's footage. So you're going to have seasonal fluctuations in terms of that. But we do know for a fact that it rained, and it's possible that by the time they got there, a lot of that rain had already flushed down. And remember, it would be delayed. You've got this drainage basin that's huge. It would take a while for a lot of that rain to sort of filter down. And that's the question, was that an issue? If the water is flowing quite strongly, a thin, slight person like Gabby would have been more susceptible to falling in the creek than someone else, right? That's also a factor. We also know that it was quite windy as late as 5 p.m. That's actually when the wind speed peaked that day at 24 miles per hour. That is over 40 kilometers per hour. I'm a cyclist, and a headwind of 40 kilometers per hour is pretty awful. That's a strong wind. It's almost a gale. Gale force winds are 31 miles per hour. So this is about 7 miles per hour short of a gale, or 50 kilometers per hour. So at around about 5 o'clock that day, there was a really strong wind blowing. And you can also imagine a strong wind would make, it would be problematic making a fire with a wind like that going on. It would also be dangerous in a wilderness situation like that to make a fire, especially with all the trees that are sort of in the... Joy Jones says he hitchhiked. That's also a good point. Simko Valinsky, thanks for that. That's a poignant point, that he was the damsel in need of help, very profound, and it must have humiliated him. Yeah. He wants to be the hero and he wants to be the big man. Imagine coming back and it's like, Gabby left me, Gabby's camping now with Rose. What's social media going to say about that? Bear in mind, they were doing their whole trip on social media. So all of these conditions, the wind, the rain, the cold, the moon going down at a particular time, all of these conditions may have conspired either to test the mettle of these would-be campers or create a scenario where one of the couple no longer wanted to brave the elements. You could have had one of the two saying, time out, that's it. I'm not really interested. Thanks, Batman. I'm not really interested, while the other one did. The other one maybe was tougher or wanted to tough it out. It was like, this isn't so bad. You can often have an argument just on that, where one person says, I'm cold, the wind's blowing right through me, this is horrible. And the other person says, it's not so bad, it's actually fun, let's put on a brave face. And that can cause dissension as well. Brian writes, she was so thin, had already been freezing too long. So it's possible that Gabby didn't want to camp. The wind was blowing. She was getting cold. She may have already stepped into the creek and she was struggling to warm up. And that's why he uses those words. This could be a reference to Gabby being the one who felt the chill wind and didn't like the wet, slippery conditions underfoot. But remember, if they were wearing thong shoes or sandals, their feet would have been especially cold. And Brian does say her feet hurt. It's possible that she twisted an ankle on one of these round rocks. He also says, I don't know the extent of Gabby's injuries. I don't believe that is true. I don't believe that he didn't know that extent. I think it's interesting that this is written in the present tense. I mean, compare her feet hurt, that's past tense, to I don't know the extent of Gabby's injuries, that's present tense. Past tense would be I didn't know, right? I think it's interesting that this is in the present tense. I'm sure Brian did actually know the extent and that she had suffered a cranial injury or a cracked skull. When Brian strangled her, I think he also knew at what point she was struggling and fighting back and at what point she stopped. I think he also knew the extent of what was happening there. So I think that's not accurate either. When he says she was freezing cold, not while she was alive, I think there was a certain amount of cold, but I think he's exaggerating it. The water was cold, but you could imagine warming up really quickly if you're not, walking through the water all the time, and you wouldn't imagine Gabby would be doing that. Then he says, I carried her as far as I could from the stream toward the car. And in this respect, you really want to look at that image of Gabby's grave, where you sort of see the cross and the length to the edge of the creek. Now, again, it's hard to say if there was some elevated water from all the rain. It's possible that the edge of the river's edge or the creek edge would have been a bit nearer. But based on where Gabby was ultimately found, she wasn't found anywhere near the river's edge, which from Brian's telling of the story was that she got wet. There was a splash. Well, this is a long way from the edge of the creek. And so it actually appears that if you actually accept his story, it appears that he carried her away from the van a long way, right? But I don't think that happened either. I don't think he was carrying her, and I don't think, so I don't think that is even sort of material. I think where this happened was where they were camping. So to reiterate, Gabby was buried some distance from the stream, from the edge of the creek, and I think it's possible Brian didn't carry her at all, but merely transferred her from the tent. So if she was cold and her feet were cold, she may have taken her boots off, gotten into a sleeping bag, and tried to warm up there. And Brian may have thought, this isn't very fun. We're camping here and I'm sitting alone and you in the tent and you're not being much of a companion, kind of thing. And then if they were separated in that way, she may have gone onto her phone. And Brian may just have felt not very happy. Bear in mind, they'd already argued earlier that day at the Merry Piglets. And then maybe not very nice things were said between them while they were not sitting together. I mean, that can be a cause for an argument. In fact, I had a little argument quite recently where exactly that happened. Somebody woke me up and I was still kind of half asleep, and this person wanted me to pay attention to her, and she'd actually just done her hair and I wasn't quite ready and she got quite upset. And so a small thing like that can be upsetting. It's like, I'm ready for your attention. Why are you not paying attention to me in the way that I want to? And then it can lead to unpleasant things being said, which then, can escalate. So I don't think Brian carried her. It's possible that he merely transferred her from the tent to a depression in the soil right outside the tent. So it's possible all of this actually took place inside the tent. Terry Dean, it's not that explicit. There's not really a lot of detail as far as I'm aware. I don't think they know the answer to that. I think manipulative as ever, he may have disguised the process of burying her or concealing her with what may have appeared from a distance to be mucking about around camp or breaking down camp, or all the activities that are involved when you are camping. You pack things up. Well, he could have put bags in a certain place and it looks like he's putting things into bags, but he's actually, finalizing a grave, Then he also said, but I wanted her out of the cold back to the car. Did he? Clearly he didn't get Gabby out of the cold and back to the car. think about it like this. At the end of the day, after everything had happened, so you might have said, Gabby, I wanted her out of the cold and back to the car. And so at the end of the day, why didn't Brian carry Gabby, dead or alive? Like, let's say, for whatever reason, he did what he did, which I don't believe he did, but let's say he did. Why would he then not, after that, carry her to the van and from there to the authorities or call 911 or whatever it is? Instead, he doesn't, he leaves her out in the cold and he returns to the van himself. He talks about, I wanted her out of the cold, back to the car, but then what does he do? He leaves her in the cold and he goes back to the car himself. Then he also writes, from where I started the fire, I had no idea how far the car might be, only knew it was across the creek. I think there was quite a long period where he would have known where the car was based on when the moon was up and based on like a tree lining. It was like over there, right? In other words, when the light was good, he would have known. I don't think it would be too hard to figure one's way across the creek because you basically needed to be going through it at right angles. You're not going to be walking along the creek and you're not going to be walking up the creek. You need to be crossing the creek. And so how hard is that? But it's possible that late at night, and given the braided nature of the streams, it might become a bit more disorienting. But they did have their phones and they likely did have flashlights, and there were other campers whose fires would have provided a kind of guiding light, almost like a lighthouse. And each time a car pulled out or drove somewhere, it would be obvious where the road was. And I think that would be another way to orientate yourself is, well, it's getting darker and there's a camper there and there's their fire and there's a camper over there and there's their fire. And our vehicle is parked there, so it's really just between the two fires. So how hard would that be? Let's look at some of your comments. Sunflower says, I wonder where the blunt force trauma was. Double Rainbows, welcome to, we've got a new member. Welcome, Double Rainbows. Thanks for joining us. Bruce T says, too heavy and scared. Ricardo Ortiz says, the letter is like a silent movie. Julie says, it was from behind. If it was from behind, he might have used his forearm. Tommy says, Brian Enton crossed the creek at one point and he was soaked and it didn't seem to be easy. And he also said that it took less than 10 minutes, which is, I guess, almost 10 minutes, which is quite a long time. So not that easy, definitely quite tricky. But not impossible either. I mean, Brian's making it out like it was impossible, and I don't know if it was. But that brings us to the biggest lie. What do you think the biggest lie is that he wrote? I think it's this. I think that's the biggest lie, where he writes, that is what she wanted. Stephanie, thanks for joining us. Good to have you here. And that now brings us to the really interesting part of this discussion, which, with all of that out the way, what's accurate, what's not accurate, now we get to the part where you've really got to apply insight. And this really tests your intuition, your knowledge of the case, your skill as an investigator, right? What's left out of this letter? So how about the word phone? The word phone isn't mentioned once in Brian's statement. Brian does refer to looking at photos from our time together, and that's right in the beginning, so that's page 1. He talks about looking at photos from our time together. Well, how do you suppose he did that? How do you look at photos of your time together with somebody? If it's on social media, well, on your phone, right? Or on your computer or on some digital device. But he doesn't really say that. He talks about, well, he doesn't say. He does refer to reading her journal and old cards, really, not her texts. And I know of two people that have, and it's sad to say, that have passed away fairly recently. One was a really good friend and a close friend. The other was someone that I didn't know very well. And I still look at their texts. I look at their, and this is all online. I mean, we didn't post letters to one another. We didn't send postcards to one another. And so that tends to be how you remember them. And so it's funny that Brian doesn't even mention that when he mentions it. But he does refer to looking at photos from our time together. Well, how do you suppose he did that? I'm just saying the word phone doesn't come up once in his 700 and something page confession. Brian also writes, I ended her life, but he doesn't say how or with what, right? I ended her life, but he doesn't say how. How did you do it? With what? When? Where? Brian doesn't say that he buried her or where he left her or how he left her. He doesn't mention her last words or what he says to her. He doesn't say what he did with Gabby's hiking gear. We know he left her hiking shoes near the scene, wrapped in a tarp, but we know that he left her hiking shoes near the scene. I think she was wrapped in a tarp, but he took her phone. We know that Brian took her phone. That's the other thing. So in terms of just some information about the finding Gabby, this is from The Sun, dated 13 October 2021. If you're interested. It just says here that Gabby Petito's body was found next to hiking shoes. Expert says it was a quickly covered up crime scene. It may also be a crime scene that was covered up. How can I put it? If you can't see very well at night, then you don't have a lot of time either, and you don't want to be seen, and you don't really know what you're doing either. Also, if Brian left the campsite afterwards, went to the van, then he may have, how can I put it, not wanted to spend too much time at the scene of the crime, if I can put it that way. He may also have wanted to remove the tent from the crime scene under the cover of night as well. So it would be good to know from the other hikers and campers, did they notice when the tent wasn't there anymore? Probably they didn't. Also, if it's true that what he did out of mercy, then leaving her body there wasn't merciful either. That's one of the things you interpret. Not telling anyone where it wasn't merciful either. So he kind of presents himself in his confession as merciful. Well, leaving her body there wasn't merciful. Not telling anyone wasn't merciful either. Brian's scenario of getting to the opposite bank only to want to rush back raises an interesting question. Why were they on the opposite bank anyway? What do you guys think? Like, why were they on this opposite bank? Were any other campers also on the opposite bank? What do you guys think is the answer to that? What were they doing on the opposite bank anyway? Like, were there any other campers that were also on the opposite bank? And I think the answer is no. No one else seemed to be on the opposite bank. Thanks a lot, Faticus. Thanks a lot. KC says they were supposedly returning from a day hike. So yeah, some answers from you guys. Tommy says for privacy. Double Rainbow says to isolate Gabby. Tommy says they didn't want to be around people. Good point. Spirit Nomad Adventure says, was his hiking days just to get rid of the tent? Michelle says they wanted to be away from people. Good point. Joy Jones says, I think they may have been hiking or something. Okay, so this is also where it's important to go into the backstory and get the information, not to speculate randomly. So the answer may be that Gabby was after an Instagrammable moment, that she wanted a particular spot where you could take a photo of the tent with the mountains behind it, and it's going to look like it's just them, and that may have been part of it. Or it could have been that Brian wanted to play Barefoot Brian and prove himself a better outdoorsman than his fellow campers. In fact, I think there's some evidence to suggest both Brian and Gabby wanted to prove they were better campers than their neighbors, right? There are Instagram posts where Gabby claims to have gone beyond what other tourists did, and perhaps they were up to the same scheme at the Sped Creek camp. And in this regard, and I went onto Gabby's Instagram today, and I pulled up a post August 12th, so 15 days, just under 2 weeks before her death. She posted something at the Arches National Park. It's a picture of herself under the arch. There are about 7 or 8 pictures that you can scroll through. It looks like a crow or raven flying above the arch, and she's looking up at it. But she's sitting on the sort of precarious side of the arches. It's sort of quite a steep slope there. And she writes the following. Now, I want you to think about this in the context of, why did they choose to sleep in a tent on the far side of the creek? I don't think anyone else was. So what is their psychology? This addresses that. So this is what she wrote on Instagram on August the 12th. We decided to take the path less traveled on the other side of the arch. After waiting in a short line for some photos under the arch early Monday morning. So they did all of this for Instagram. They went to all of this trouble. They took the path less traveled in order to have this Instagrammable moment, right? Wow, my lips are really, really dry. I wonder what that's about. Maybe it's just winter. So she writes, after waiting in a short line for some photos under the arch early Monday morning. So you also get the idea they're going to get up early to miss the crowds to get this photo. So if they go to bed, if they get up early in the morning, doesn't it mean they go to bed fairly early as well? We wanted to find a place to relax and draw while still admiring the arch, but also get away from the crowd that kept growing as the day went on. So that's another reason to get up early. You're going to be able to take photos with people not being around. We walked just a little past the arch where the rock is at such an angle, it appears impossible to walk on. But being such experienced hikers, I had confidence that I could make it, ! While at Bizarre Design, that's Brian, climbed down some steep slopes with a camera, I shimmied my way along a thin, flat, narrow line that led directly to a big flat rock with the absolute most beautiful view from directly underneath the arch, ! After taking a few cool photos of each other, Bizarre Design and I sat drawing and enjoying the nature without seeing anybody who was online or taking photos. It felt like we had the entire delicate arch to ourselves, ! We got to spend about 2 hours relaxing here on this side of the arch with nobody bothering us. And so there you have your answers. They want to be away from people, and that's why they went to the other side of the creek. So it's to take good photos, it's to be away from people, and it's to enjoy the fact that they experience hikers compared to everybody else, right? But one does have to wonder if on that particular occasion they didn't go across the creek. So let's say for whatever reason, they camped right by the van, right? Let me say that again. If for whatever reason they camped right by the van, do you think Gabby would still be alive? Julie Ann says something. So in terms of the poll, 0% where you say how much of Brian's narrative is anchored in real events, it's gone from 40% to 39%. So 39% say none of it's true, and 2% are saying all of it's true. A third of you, about half of you say about a third of it is true, and around 11% say about half of it is true. Interesting. Okay. Sunflower says carrying equipment, tent, and supplies away from the van across the creek still doesn't make sense. Well, you would carry it there to set up camp, when you start off. Choice says, I've never been on Instagram. Willa says, it's possible she would still be alive if they were within earshot of others. Yeah, although I think she may have been in earshot anyway, like kind of barely in earshot kind of thing. I don't know how loud the creek sounds were. I suppose that's a factor as well. Also, the wind would also be a factor, and the wind was blowing. Joy Jones, and bear in mind the wind can also carry sounds. Joy Jones says, I think it was just boiling and he would have done something at some point. No, well, I must say, I think if they camped by the van, I don't think anything would have happened that night or then, kind of thing. Okay, so Brian makes no reference to the abundance of rocks in the area. That's another thing to highlight. He doesn't ever mention the tent, shoes, a medical aid kit, and I think they did have that as part of the van's paraphernalia. He doesn't mention bags that they had with them. Often you will have a day pack or whatever. I don't think he mentions food either. All of these would have been essential to the narrative, the way that he frames it. He also makes no mention of tears or blood. The biggest gaping hole is their relationship dynamic, and the best clue we have to those are from the body cam during the Moab incident. We get a sense of the relationship dynamic immediately after a fight by looking at Gabby and hearing what she says and how she says it, and looking at Brian and his demeanor and how he says it and how he frames it. One thing that we can see in a generic sense is that Brian was a loner with no friends. Loners can be very loving, attentive, and loyal, like Chris Watts, when they're in love, but that same love can be different when it's codependent or when things aren't going very well. So if they're codependent in an emotional sense and a financial sense, and there's ego codependence as well, then that love that is so attentive and kind and sweet may become jealousy. The attentiveness can become control. The loyalty morphs into obsession and paranoia. So a lonely person is a self-centered person by their very nature. You might say, wow, I can't believe you're thinking about yourself all the time. Well, who else are they supposed to think about when they don't know anyone else? So that selfishness, and by the way, Gabby's mother put in her tweet today, #selfish. But it's just because he's operating on his own default settings, right? And so the challenge when a loner type person, one of these people, meets someone is the challenge is to think about the other person, even when they're not very happy. To be kind, even when their default setting is to be selfish, or when they hurt, not to revert to their default settings, kind of thing. It's quite hard for these people to graduate away from the default settings. It's hard for anyone to graduate away from the default settings. A lonely person has very little practice thinking of somebody else. They're just used to doing their own things their own way. So everything is about them because they are their sum total in terms of a frame of reference. Everything is about them because everything is about them. Although loners can be generous, and desperate loners can be especially kind and considerate when they want something, when they try to make themselves attractive to others, they are also easily stung, and thus they're also quick to lash out. So a loner kind of has these two faces where they can be very sweet and kind, but if you upset them, they can, sort of flash into something else. In South Africa, we call it vipping. You sort of vip into, like, from very sweet to being very sour, from being very kind to very selfish, from very generous to holding a grudge, right? Loners feel hurt quicker and easier than the average person. They're hypersensitive to themselves and often insensitive to those around them. We know Brian didn't seem to care much that his feet were dirty and smelled. And so, because he's used to just being in his own space. So someone's complaining, well, I'm not going to worry about that. But he cared a lot about how much time Gabby was spending on her silly blog. That comes from the Moab incident. During their summer epic, Gabby's social media was a dimension set to grow and expand, and it did. And by the way, right now, Gabby Petito's Instagram's got 1.2 million followers. Whereas as the summer epic wore on, Brian was being exposed for what he was, a loser, a prickly guy with no money and a wafer-thin sense of self. Gabby was seeing that as well. He was seeing that. Worst of all, the world was seeing it as well. And this is the dimension that I think a lot of people are missing. During the van life misadventure, Brian was increasingly being exposed not as a shining hero, but as a gleaming fake, but not just to Gabby, also to everybody else. And that was what made it so much more painful and more humiliating. It was a dimension he wasn't used to. And so he would be seeing comments and other things, and that it's just not pleasant. And it's like, well, I'm engaged to you. This isn't right. How do I control this? And so the social media dimension was one where Brian was really, really exposed. And it was like, how do you get out of this? Like, the whole world is watching. How do you get out of this? And not only that, I don't know if he knew, I don't know if he would have expected after what happened, that it would get even worse on social media. Now it's really exposed. Now there's no place to hide. Now, how do you come back and live happily ever after? And so that brings us to the final area, which is what likely did happen. And if I was writing a book, I would probably write a scenario which is speculative. It's based on everything we know. And also importantly, it's based on knowing Brian and Gabby, right? And so it would be an italicized reenactment or a dramatization. I'm not quite doing that here, but I'm doing something that is something like that. Willow says, I think he was very threatened that Rose would take his place on the journey as a better social media presence. Okay, so here we go. What likely did happen? Okay, Timmy, come. So I think one's got to ask the question, what was the significance of the van door closing on August 27th? Now, I know there were some sites, some YouTubers who got like, I don't know what it was, 100,000 views, 200,000 views, a million views, whatever it was, of this van door closing. And it was like, whoa, this is, something happened here. So now it's a year later, what do you think the significance was of the van door closing on August 27th? What was that actually ultimately about? And so the question to ask really is, was Gabby still alive at that stage? What do you guys think? While we're waiting for the answer, I just want to ask Stephanie. Stephanie, do you still want to review this book? Do you still want to maybe discuss this book and maybe what impact it may have had on, if any, on Brian's psychology, and also what impact you see or what impact is maybe possible from this book in his confession? Is there anything that stands out to you? Because it is quite interesting. From the back of the book, it talks about lullaby was traditionally sung in Africa according to the tradition of this, the schema of this book, where it was used as sort of euthanasia, where you would give someone a painless death if they were old or infirm. Isn't that exactly what he's talking about in his own letter? So where's Brian gotten his narrative experience from? Where's he learned to tell stories or to make up stories from? Right? So I don't know, Stephanie, if you're interested in taking that on, let me know if you are. I know you've read the book, and so just let me know what you think about that. Stephanie says, I think it's extremely important. That said, I would like to reread it first. Okay. Stephanie says, and you can post my book review here on YouTube if you'd like to. Okay. Sherry B says, I think she, okay, Sherry believes that Gabby was already deceased inside the van. So you're saying in broad daylight, so early on the 27th. So that would make virtually everything. So then he went and camped opposite the creek by himself, and he left Gabby in the van, and that's where everyone's driving past. It's just worth, you must think it through. If that's your theory, you need to think it through. Pedals for Show says, was Brian in the van or hitchhiking after, and why? Okay, and why? Jeffrey Richard says, Stephanie, I want to read it. Okay, so that's just something to revisit and think about. It's a year later. We know quite a lot now that we didn't know. So again, what was the significance of the van door closing on August 27th? Was Gabby still alive at that stage? And that kind of made the news on September 20th, 2021. For example, on the website Insider. Well, Timmy's just kicked the bottom of my glass. Anyway, it says close-up of footage said to show Gabby Petito's van near where a body was found appeared to show the rear door closing. So here's my personal opinion on that. I don't know if I buy a scenario that they argued inside the van on the way back from the Merry Piglets, and that Gabby lost her life inside the van. I'd considered that, but I don't know if I buy that scenario now. Brian then drove the van close to the edge of the creek, reversed it so its rear end faced slightly towards the water. Brian then carried Gabby across the creek to where she was finally found. That's the part that I think, if you believe that, doesn't really make any sense. Maybe you think he did that at night. I don't. It's possible, of course, but I think it's improbable because it would have had to have happened in broad daylight. I'm talking about what he did to Gabby would have had to have happened in broad daylight, which I just think is unlikely. I believe that this crime happened at night. And I think it could also be that both Gabby and Brian wanted to camp on the opposite side of the creek and hence had parked where they did to facilitate carrying their tent and things. So although we know they argued at the Merry Piglets, I suspect the argument erupted again, not later that day, but later that night. So whatever opprobrium kind of came to the surface during the Merry Piglets, I think it came back that night. Gabby, in his mind, may have started it. She may have started this argument. So this is my scenario for what they were arguing about that led to things going so badly, leading to a crime, right? Again, I want you to ask yourself the question, does your brain control you or do you control your brain? Think about that as we go through this scenario. So this is my scenario. Gabby, in his mind, may have started it, and it may have started with words or with Gabby being on her phone or both. We know that there was a strong internet signal right across the creek, which means when Brian wanted to camp and wanted some me time, I think, in other words, time with Gabby, Gabby may have undermined that by being on her phone, possibly finding out that Rose had taken off work and planned to spend her birthday with them, and maybe she was communicating around that and around arrangements and around, that sort of thing. If Gabby communicated this, it may well have set Brian off. So if Brian just heard about Rose's name and the possibility of her joining them, that may have been enough for him to start losing it. It may also have started the same way the Moab incident started, with Brian taking away Gabby's phone. Gabby's social media was almost certainly a bugbear for Brian, and so seizing her phone likely wasn't a first on this night. I don't think it was the first time he took her phone. I don't think it was the first time he'd been annoyed at what she was doing on social media. We also know that Brian used Gabby's phone to simulate that she was alive after she was dead. So him seizing her phone makes sense. I'm talking about in the middle of this. Remember the no service in Yosemite text that Brian sent from Gabby's phone? Anyone remember that? That's kind of proof that I think that Brian did have her phone. It's also kind of the same thing. The whole no service in Yosemite is a kind of contrivance which he also makes use of in his confessional letter. He comes up with a fiction. Anyway, so I think Brian may have chased Gabby to get the phone, or Gabby may have chased Brian to get it back. So if Gabby was, let's say she was in the tent, maybe she was cold, maybe her feet were cold, and maybe she didn't have her shoes on, and she was on her phone. Brian goes into the tent, grabs the phone out of her hands. Gabby then must get out the tent and pursue him, but she doesn't have her shoes on, right? So she may have chased Brian to get it back. If one or the other had the phone, now bear in mind Brian may have had his footwear on, and now it's hard for Gabby to catch him. And then when she can't, and Brian turns around, he doesn't know where Gabby is. And anyway, there may have been some or other sort of stalemate. Gabby may have tossed a stone or a stick at him in frustration. She can't reach him, and he may have returned the favor. Perhaps she threw a stone that struck her on the head. There were stones lying all over the place. Then when he went over to see how she was, she struck him. She had before. And then the fighting that had been escalated there and then. He responded, but a lot more severely. She screamed, and then he tried to shut her up. He hit her with a rock to silence her, much as I believe John Bonet was struck to silence her mid-scream. Gabby fought back, leading to even worse blows. It was the Moab incident all over again, only worse, because now it was the drama and resentment of the Moab incident piled on top of that day's stress. Something happened at the Merry Piglets, and both of them realized they were done with one another. She was done with him, perhaps for not backing her up in the Merry Piglets. Or for never having any money, and her telling him that she was done and inviting Rose along, and all the invalidation from social media made him feel he was done with her. So the feeling was kind of mutual. Only he couldn't let her go if he was done. She could let him go. If she was done, he couldn't let her go. So he had to be done in a different way. He couldn't let her be with someone else. How would that look for him and his family? He couldn't let her do that. And that's when he picked up a bigger stone. So that brings up the following question, which I think one's got to pause when we say it, when we ask it, and kind of be sensitive about it. What else could have caused blunt force trauma to the skull? And I'm talking about lethal blunt force trauma. And after that, there was no turning back. This time, he wouldn't be able to wriggle out of things. This time, Gabby would say what he did, if there was law enforcement. He couldn't have that. He couldn't have the Moab incident again. That was a close enough call. But she was still making sounds. In his confession, he said she was gasping. She was breathing heavily. And this was after her head had been struck. At any moment, she might call out. How do you make someone stop breathing, stop talking, stop making a sound? And that's my assessment. So if we go back to the poll, if we go back to how much of Brian's narrative is anchored in real events, 39% say 0%, 49% say 33%, 10% say 50% or more, 2% say 100%. Well, I don't think 0% is accurate. I think some of it is accurate. For example, he says, I ended her life. That's accurate. So it's not 0%. I also don't think it's 100%. I think it's somewhere between 33% and 50% or more. I'm not really sure which one it is. It could be a little bit more than 33%. I don't know, but it's somewhere in the middle there. If you want to know the answer specifically, one's really got to go through it and sort of assess each sentence and say true, not true, whatever, but it's also subjective. Stephanie says, are you comfortable with sharing your email? No, please don't. If someone wants to communicate with me, you can do so on Twitter. Okay, so that's my assessment and also my thoughts regarding the poll. I see 470 have voted. If you haven't voted, make sure that you do. Now we come back to this question, does your brain control you or do you control your brain? And think about that in terms of the question on its own merits. Think about that in terms of Brian in a situation. Do you think Brian was in control of what was going on when it happened during this incident? Or do you think who was in control, Brian or his brain? What was actually going on there? Now, quite an interesting way of expanding that question is ask when, like, I don't know if you guys were watching Wimbledon. I was watching the game with a guy called Duckworth and Andy Murray, right? Anyone here from the UK? Any folks from England? But if you, for example, if you're watching a tennis game or any sports game, it could be football, could be baseball, could be whatever. What do you think is running the show there? Do you think it's the brain, or do you think it is the person? What's running the show? What is who's in control? The brain or you? What do you think it is? Now think about with tennis. Why do tennis players train? Is it to get control of the brain, or to get the brain to control the body? What do you think that's all about? Jody says the brain controls the body, primal instincts kick in. Tiffany Hall says the person. Double Rainbows said instinct versus emotion. Stephanie talks about losing your mind. What happens when you lose your mind? So it's actually a more complicated question than you might imagine. If you take the question from tennis to social media, so in tennis, for example, a player gets a ball and they hit it back and it's this incredible shot. Was that on purpose, or was it kind of programming? They hit the shot so many times before, they just did what they've done so many times in training. Is training a kind of programming so that you're on autopilot, right? Anyway, so you take tennis and you move it onto social media. What happens when a person is on social media, right? What happens when you are on the social media of, say, the Depp versus Heard trial, or you're generally on Twitter, or you're generally on Instagram? What's kind of taking place? All of your responses are becoming binary. So it's either this or it's that, right? And that also makes you a person who's like a us versus them person. I'm just saying, the more time you spend on social media, the more you're going to be in binary opposition generally. You're going to see someone as the enemy, or someone who is against you, and someone who, you're not going to see things, you're not going to see subtlety and nuance as much as you otherwise would. Again, you've got to ask the question, who's in control then? Your brain. Is your brain in control, or are you in control? Right? And then it comes to crime. When a crime takes place, who's in control? The person's brain or the person? So when Chris Watts committed his crime, was Chris Watts in control? Was he in control? Was his brain in control? Another question to ask is with love. When you love somebody, are you in control of yourself, or are you losing control of yourself? Is your brain in control, or is something else in control, right? And it's a very interesting question, because like the poll question, it seems to be quite simple, but when you think about it, you realize, well, there's actually a lot more to this than the simplicities of the question. The question itself is reductionist. So the answer to the question is, the control we have over ourselves is a factor of things like programming, our emotions, things like discipline, things like your self-esteem, things like constructs like your ego. Your ego can also decide what you will do one way or the other. I think Brian's ego is definitely a factor. Another aspect is anxiety. One of the things that directs your ability to function one way or the other is anxiety. If you can handle anxiety, then you can think in a rational way what to do in a certain situation. If your anxiety overcomes you, you're no longer thinking in a rational way or in a cognitive way. Instead, your thinking gets taken over by your programming, right? If you think about social media as a kind of programming, that's a really good example of social media programming your brain. And so your brain is telling you what to do, and you are now kind of on autopilot, and so you're functioning almost in a remote way in your own body, and social media is just taking over. It's like, oh, recommended video, click on that. Yes, I'm also interested in that. And all of these things are doing your thinking for you. All you're doing is really deciding, yes, more of that, please, more of that. It's not really thinking, but now your thinking is becoming programmed. And the algorithm is also figuring that out and going, oh, this is going to work, this is going to work. And then you just take the path of least resistance, right? Another thing that determines your programming is habits. Are you in the habit of doing this or doing that? One of the ways that habits take place is with social media. How much time do you habitually spend on social media, right? If you apply that to Brian and to Gabby, what was their programming? What were their habits? What was their psychology? What were their beliefs? What were their motives? Another aspect that is part of your programming in a way is culture. You may have certain programs that are running inside of you, but they're nevertheless going to be governed by your culture. And your culture is often initially formed by your family. And I think Brian's cultural psychology was to a large extent formed by his family, and the fact that his sister was married, his older sister was married, and his older sister had kids. For him, the cultural thing that he was heading towards was marriage. That was the one thing he wanted to do and the one thing he wanted to be. Culture can also, to some extent, be informed by society and by the country that you live in, right? All of that is going to affect your programming. Another good example is, for example, today I did 2 workouts. I went for a cycle, which is quite far, and my legs are still hurting from that. And then it was really cold, and it's pretty cold tonight. I went at night to gym to swim, but I really didn't want to. So who's in control when you don't want to do something like exercise and the conditions aren't great and you don't feel like it, but you do it anyway? Who's in control there? Are you in control, or is your brain in control? Now, when you don't want to do something like that, it's kind of your brain coming up with excuses. To the extent that you control your brain, that is self-discipline. That's where you say, although I don't want to, and there are many good reasons not to do this, because of my beliefs, because of the goals I've set for myself, because of my ability to overcome anxiety of the cold water, because of either my self-esteem or my need for self-esteem, I'm going to override some of those brain things, right? So I'm going to take charge, right? But when a crime takes place, that can happen in reverse, where, well, let's put it this way, where something not very good happens and your programming takes over. The triggers take over and the thought process is really removed from that. And it feels like you're acting automatically. And there may be certain things that have been part of that programming. It might be violent fantasies. It may be daydreams. It may be books that have been read, right? It may be emotions and feelings that are very strong. But all of that is going to be brought to the surface by these triggers. And then that programming takes over. And I think that the key question then to ask is your programming your brain, or is your programming you? And I think the answer is your programming is kind of your brain. You decide whether you're self-aware and whether you're going to transcend your programming, whether you're going to interrupt the programming. And that's where criminals often aren't able to do that. They aren't able to say, stop. What are the consequences of this action going to be, right? In other words, the person interrupts and then is able to confront the thinking and allow the brain to escape its programming. Does that make sense? Willow says, what does Willow say? Missing Casey Anthony. Well, yeah, that's almost over. Are you talking about the audiobook? Okay. Robbie Robin, that neuroplasticity again. But I think in Brian's case, the things that were very formative in terms of his programming were his emotions, his feelings. You must bear in mind at the end of the day, he decides he's not good enough to live. I mean, that is his self-esteem. That's ultimately his self-esteem. His suicide, Brian's suicide, is proof that he absolutely believes he's nothing without Gabby. That's his psychology, right? Because the person doesn't exist, so that is his programming. And I think he murdered her probably because he understood he was nothing with Gabby. So the reason he murdered her was this epiphany of, well, even with you, I'm nothing. And where did that come from? I think because she communicated that to him. I'm done. I'm with you. You mean nothing to me. It's over. This isn't working out. And so in terms of being with Gabby, he realizes I'm nothing to her. I don't mean anything to her anymore. The whole social media aspect probably played a role in that as well. She didn't want him anymore, right? Somebody asked the question, why didn't Brian just lie his way out? In other words, why didn't he just come home, have the authorities question him and just lie? You know, why didn't he do kind of what Chris Watts did? In other words, take his chance, not commit suicide, right? And I think the answer is in three areas. Because he had low self-esteem, because of the social media explosion that was taking place, and because of the evidence as well. I think I don't know whether he felt that he was going to be very credible. So I think he was anticipating global humiliation kind of thing. And I just think he couldn't take that. But I think primarily it was because I think he did feel, I can't live without Gabby. I think he did love her a lot in his own twisted way. And he just felt, I can't live without her, and so I don't want to live without her. And that is rooted in low self-esteem kind of thing. Mel Stiller says Brian wasn't strong enough to face the consequences of his actions. Well, in a way, he did. I mean, doing what he did is, in a way, facing them. It's, in a way, punishment, in a way. So that's my story. I don't think I'm going to go further than 2.5 hours. Timmy, do you want to get up? Did you guys hear Timmy snoring just now? Earlier. Bruce says fear and shame, although also motivations for, yeah, it is. Michelle says, why didn't he kill himself out there after her? I suppose you could say because anger is an emotion that activates. And I don't know, was he operating from fear or from anger? If he was a coward because he killed Gabby and he was a coward because he didn't own up to it, I think he was a coward initially, didn't want to do that. And maybe he also thought, maybe he assumed, and I think he says so in his confession, he says, I made a mistake, and I think he assumed that maybe he wouldn't miss Gabby. He assumed that he would perhaps be able to live without her, and then realized that he couldn't. maybe didn't feel really badly about it after they'd argued, maybe felt like I did want to do that. Maybe also felt like I can get away with this, right? I think it also shows someone who's caught up in a fantasy world, like Brian committing the crime and then thinking he can get away with it is him being in a bit of a fantasy, right? Stargirl says, if you're not acting out, is that of life, I think you're acting out of fear. Sinners Camilo, look for severe childhood disturbances. No, I'm not sure I agree with that. Sometimes there are a lot of people who have horrible romances, and I don't mean most people, but I'm just saying it happens quite often. Someone has a first love and it doesn't work out and they don't want to carry on living. It's not that unusual. It's devastating. It's kind of a cliche in a way. Along the way says, excellent, thanks Nick, thanks a lot for that. Susan says, Brian needed his parents to fix it. Unfortunately, they couldn't fix it this time for him. Bruce says, social media reality of the public. Social media of the public love for Gabby and hatred for him must have obliterated his fantasy world. That's a good question. I don't know how aware he was of the social media. I don't know. I mean, he lost, the police took his phone fairly early on. And he wasn't on a terrible amount of social media, but I'm sure it was a factor. The question is, how much of a factor was it? I'm just saying a lot of it he missed because he was either on the move or in the wild kind of thing. Did he have a burner phone with him? Maybe that was a factor. Doesn't seem that way. Was a phone recovered with his things? It doesn't appear that way. I'm talking about in the national park. Adrian says, not everyone who kills had a bad childhood. Yeah, I mean, look at Chris Watts. I think he had quite a good childhood. But also not completely straightforward. Margaret says it looks like Timmy sleeps with his eyes open sometimes. That's not sleeping, he's just relaxing. I think he's like looking at me like, aren't you done? Well, I am going to be done in about 2 minutes. So I just want to thank the mods that are here. Sharon, Stephanie, is there anyone else? So the two of you, I just want to thank you for being here. I also want to thank the subscribers who've kept it mostly clean and tidy, and the members as well. And there's 1 or 2 new members that have also signed up. Thanks a lot for that. If you're watching this on replay, bear in mind my channel's taking a little bit of strain. Whenever I put up a Van Gogh video, it's like minus 8 or 10 subscribers. So if you're watching this and you found value in it, don't be shy to hit the thanks button. If you contributed a super chat, and I know quite a few of you did, thank you very much to you guys. I do want to cover this, so look out for this. When Stephanie's ready, I don't know when that will be, but it might be a week or 2 from now, but I'll try and get hold of the, she did leave an audio review, and I think she also wrote down a review, so we'll try and get to that. It's actually very interesting and also quite disturbing. you might think it's not a big deal, the books Brian read, but he repeatedly puts them in his social media, and it's by the same author every single time. And it's not like any author like Michael Crichton or John Grisham. It's the material is very, very different. If I look at this review here, it says, among sick puppies, and then it mentions the author's name, is the top dog. Someone else says, more twisted than a sack of pretzels. And so if you've got a young person reading this, could it influence them in some way? Did it influence Brian in some way? And I think when you're a weak personality and you've got a weak ego and a weak self-esteem, the question is, how does certain media influence a person like that? If you don't have any identity and no thinking, how does thoughts from others influence you? Can it to some extent take over your programming? Did it in this case? W says you control the brain with will or desire. Well, you can control the brain by being mindful, by kind of waking up and saying, I can choose how I'm going to respond to this. I can operate beyond my programming. This is not my identity. Who I am is not what my thoughts are saying or what I feel like I want to do, right? That is where you are mindful and you're self-aware, and also where you create yourself, where you say, this is who I am, and you focus on that, and you're not like influenced by everything else, where you create yourself and where your character is based on who you really are. It's not a contrivance, it's not a construct, it's not fake, it's authentic, right? So to the extent that you can create an authentic self, that interrupts all of this nonsense that leads to criminality and mindless action and mindless programming and all that, right? Who's that from? Status Quo. Thought I'd sneak this in. Thanks a lot. Okay, and that I think concludes this episode. I've got something else in store for you guys, but I don't really want to talk about it just yet. I felt even this episode, you give too long notice, another channel sees what you're doing and they get an idea and then they copy what you're doing. So unfortunately, as much as I'd like to sort of be transparent about this is what I'm going to do and I'm going to do that next, you sort of got to be aware, okay, let me play my cards quite close to the chest. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm not going to tell you what I'll be doing next beyond the review, but it should be quite interesting in terms of the narrative we've covered so far. Again, thanks guys for listening. Take care of yourselves and I'll see you guys next time.